Hello, Trinity Baptist. This is your message recorded on, I guess today's Tuesday, July 19th. This is a message or Bible study on Genesis chapter 34. We're not going to be covering this chapter on a Sunday morning for a few reasons. One is that we're galloping toward the end of our series on the book of Genesis. Our goal is to have the book completed by the end of August, and we knew that we might need to do a few supplemental teachings and recordings to do so. So that's what this is. And we've been focusing on the life of Jacob. In this chapter, Genesis 34, although it's during the life of Jacob, it's not really focused on the character of Jacob. This is more focused on Jacob's daughter Dinah and his sons. Although he's in the chapter, it's not really this story doesn't really focus on the character of Jacob. So I thought I would do a recording to kind of explain this chapter in case you're curious. And there's some real nuggets to take out of here. So I didn't want to pass it over. So here you go. I hope you enjoy it. By the way, I did send another message. I uploaded another video on Genesis 34, and I took it down because I got a few of the details wrong on that first one. I discovered it afterwards, so I uploaded. I was like, oh no, I got this down wrong, so I wanted to get it right. So this is my second take at it. This is my second run at it, getting those details right. So here we go. Genesis 34. Hope you have your Bibles, and let's read through. By the way, this happens right after Jacob's reunion with Esau. This is where Jacob settles after they reconcile and come back together. Verse 1 of chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter Leah had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as my wife." When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock, so he did nothing about it until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk to Jacob. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the fields as soon as they had heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. But Hamor said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters, and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it." Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask of me. Only give me the young woman as my wife." Because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, "We can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be disgraceful to us. We will enter into an agreement with you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all of your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you. But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we'll take our sister and go." Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem. The young man, who was the most honored of all his father's family, lost no time in doing what they had said, because he was so delighted with Jacob's daughter. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of their city to speak to the men of the city. They said, "These men are friendly toward us. Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters and they can marry ours. But the men will agree to live with us as one people only on the condition that our males be circumcised as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all of their animals become ours? So let us agree to their terms, and they will settle among us. All the men who went out to the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in their houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the people living in the land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, "Should we have treated our sister like a prostitute?" Whew, tough chapter. What shall we make of this account of Dinah? Her, just being raped and mistreated, and the brutal justice that was meted out by Jacob's sons to the Shechemites. What do we make of all that? Well, we're going to get to that, but before we do, I'd like to give a little bit of context here, peel back some layers to uncover some things that will help us to understand some broader things going on. One is genealogy. Who are these Hivites? Who are these Shechemites? These people living in Shechem. Well, if you recall, Noah had 3 sons, and those sons had wives. And after the flood, they had families. And one of Noah's sons, Ham, had a son named Canaan. And from Canaan comes all the tribes living in this promised land, in this land of Canaan. And Canaan's sons, in fact, are the heads of these tribes. And one of those tribes is the tribe called the Hivites. And they are the ones that live in this area called Shechem. So, in a sense, the Hivites, or the Shechemites, are distant relatives of Jacob's family. A bit of geography and geology, I guess. The word Shechem apparently it can mean shoulder, it can mean saddle. More likely, it describes the geological features of that area. There are 2 mountains that form kind of a saddle-like formation, and this is where the city belonging to the Hivites, the place called Shechem, is located. This, by the way, isn't the first time that Shechem has appeared in the Genesis narrative. The site was actually Abraham's first stop when he left Haran and came to the land of Canaan in obedience to God's command. In fact, in chapter 12, verse 7, it says that the Lord appeared to Abraham when he came to this place and spoke to him there. This is kind of like his first time speaking to Abraham after he had come into the land of Canaan. And he promises him there, he says, "To your offspring I will give this land." So this is a significant encounter that Abram has, and so significant, in fact, that Abraham builds an altar of remembrance there. So this is a significant location for Jacob's family. He's that offspring that God has promised this very land to. It's an altar site. It represents God's promise to Jacob and his children that he would establish them as God's people of promise, to prosper them and increase them in this promised land. And by the way, this Sunday, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into more into altars and names and the significance of remembrance. So make sure you tune in this Sunday. So yes, this place called Shechem represents God's promise. And maybe this is why Jacob came here when he came out from where his uncle Laban lived, Padan Aram. Perhaps this is why he came here to Shechem, because this is the place his grandfather had heard that his descendants would be given this land. But in today's story, we see that this place of promise, this place of remembrance, is also a place of conflict. You might say that this place of God's promise also became a place of testing, or a place that promise was resisted. So let's dig into how that conflict occurred. The sad story of Dinah. Oh man, this is a terrible story. The story goes, the son of the ruler, local ruler, his name's Shechem, the Hivite ruler, Hamor's dad, is in that area. Dinah goes out to, meet with the women, the Hivite women, and Shechem sees her, takes her, and rapes her. But in the process of taking advantage of her, he falls in love with her. And the scriptures don't tell us how Dinah is doing in all this. All we know is that after this sexual encounter, Shechem, he's begging his father to arrange a marriage. And it's not out of guilt either. He really thinks he loves this woman. Now we aren't told how Jacob finds out about the rape. It could be that Dinah came back and confided in her family, or perhaps Jacob heard it another way, but he finds out and decides for the time being to do nothing about it until his sons come back. Clearly this is an explosive situation. It could cause violence, ripple effects in the community, between those tribes, and so he wants to wait till the strength of his family's back there, although I don't think he realizes how his sons will react to this situation. In verse 7, we see their reaction to the news. It says that Jacob's sons came back from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. So they leave everything, they come back, and it says they were shocked and furious because Shechem, that's the name of the rapist, because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel or against Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. Okay, this is a loaded verse, so we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at it. First of all, I just want to point out that there's kind of a blending of the singular and the corporate. So Shechem is the name of the son of Hamor, the one who raped Dinah, but it's also the name of the city. So there's this kind of blending or connecting the man with the tribe. And that happens on the other side too. Jacob is also called Israel here. And he's called Jacob, and then it says here in verse 7, because Shechem had done an outrageous thing against Israel or in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter. So there's this sense, because Jacob has been renamed Israel, there's the sense of Jacob being singular, but also representing his tribe. So that's something that we're meant to notice in this verse, that this isn't just about an evil act. This is about two communities that are coming into a conflict of values or a conflict of worldviews. So let's just kind of put that on hold. I'm going to come right back to that. So to Shechem and his father Hamor, this is kind of just normal stuff. For their people, to the Hivites, there's no thought of they've done something like that. Shechem has done something wrong here. There's no thought of justice here. Hamor isn't coming, apologizing for his son. He's not offering to make reparations or punish his son in any way. No, they're coming because Shechem wants to marry Dinah. And he's not coming to marry her because he's feeling guilty about what happened. He wants her. And so there's no sense that they have done anything wrong. He's fallen for her, and he wants to take her as his wife. And so it seems that this kind of behavior was normal for the Hivites. In verse 8, we see that they even invite Jacob's family into their cultural norms, right? They say, hey, let's expand this arrangement. I mean, you guys and we, like our two tribes, we can kind of become one. You can take our daughters, we'll take your daughters. You can settle in this land. There's lots of room. We can trade with one another. We can basically intermingle until we're just one big happy tribe. But verse 7 also gives us some commentary on the divergent values of Jacob and his sons. To them, this act was not normal. It was rape. It was shocking to them. They were furious about it. They called it an outrageous thing done against Israel or in Israel. And so we can see that there is kind of a big gap between the values of these two tribal groups or these two ethnic groups. And this wasn't just a sin against Dinah. This wasn't just a sin against Jacob. This was a sin against the whole tribe. This is a sin against the whole family. All right, so what is going on here? Well, we are actually beginning to see the growth of a corporate or a national identity here. Although the Hivites are distant relatives, descended from Noah, same with Jacob, they can find the same ancestor there. The Hivites have departed from the fear of God. They're moving again towards the evil that caused the flood, the evil in the heart. They are involved in the same kind of sexual behaviors that the judgment fell upon Sodom and Gomorrah for. And so they are identified in this text as doing things that are unrighteous or unholy, things that ought not to be done. And I just want you to remember kind of who is it that Genesis is written to? It's to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. They're gaining a national identity. And it's clear in the Torah that morality or not doing what ought not to be done, this is being connected to their identity as a people group. In some places, people might say that what we believe about what's right and what's wrong, this is sort of like we're a pluralistic group. You're free to believe this is right and wrong. I'm free to believe this is right and wrong. We can coexist. Well, for the people of Israel, at Mount Sinai, receiving the law, Moses was probably writing this story or recounting this story as a cautionary tale, saying, we are a distinct people, and part of what makes us a people set apart is the fact that we are holy. We are called to live in the fear of God and according to his commands. And we aren't to live like the nations around us and practice the things that they practice. In fact, in Leviticus 18, Moses tells the Israelites to not practice sexual relations like the nations in Canaan. And in verse 27, he says this, "For all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you." So there's this deep concern in the Torah, in the books of the law, that part of what it means to be God's special possession is that they remain set apart, that they remain under the fear of God, and that they're holy, like God is holy. Okay, so let's keep going. So Shechem, he goes on to speak up in the meeting between his father Hamor and Jacob and his sons. And he says, basically, he writes a blank check. He says he wants Dinah so bad. He just says, hey, I'll pay you whatever you want. And, of course, Jacob's sons have no intention of letting their sister marry Shechem. They've hatched a revenge plan. So they say, well, hey, it's against our religion to give our sister to an uncircumcised man, which is true. In Genesis 17, God commands Abraham to circumcise all males connected to the family. This is a sign that they're God's covenant people. The rule is very strict, no exceptions. All males born into the family, those slaves brought into the clan, and in this case, marriage, all the males part of this clan must be circumcised, or they would be cut off from the family. And you might say, cut it off or be cut off kind of thing. So Jacob's sons expand this even beyond Shechem and Hamor, and they say, well, hey, if you want us to intermarry, and you want to intermarry with our women and settle with one another, actually all the men from the Hivites have to be likewise circumcised. And so Shechem, his dad Hamor, and all the men in that city were circumcised. And 3 days later, Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, go to the city. They take their swords. They kill every male in revenge for the defiling of their sister. And then the other brothers come behind them, and they plunder it. They take herds, flocks, wives, children. They take it all as plunder. Jacob is appalled by all of this. It says in verse 30, he's lecturing his sons. He's dressing them down. He says, "You've brought trouble on me by making me a stench in the stench to the people of this land. We are not a lot of people, and if they combine forces, they can wipe us out." And so Jacob he's just totally flabbergasted that his sons were capable of doing this. And I'm guessing that Jacob's also remembering God's promise to his father Abraham, right? Abraham was promised that he would be the father of a great nation, and that they would be a blessing to the nations. Well, this is very far from being a blessing. I don't think God had this in mind when he said this, that they would be a blessing to the nations. You know, this looks more like destroying and pillaging than blessing. Okay, so is there anything that you and I can take away from this difficult chapter? Actually, I think there is. I think that there's some very poignant connecting points for us as God's people living today in the world. In fact, I think there's a lot of New Testament scriptures that we could point to that really connect well with this chapter. For instance, we, God's people, we too are God's special possession, living in a land that God has promised to prosper us in. In 1 Peter 2:9, it says this, the Apostle Peter says this to the church. He says, we are a chosen people. He's talking to Christians. We are a chosen people. We are a holy nation. We are God's special possession. And we're to be set apart. As we live among the nations, we're to be a set apart people. And as we, in Matthew 28, Jesus himself commissions us. He sends us to the nations to make disciples of all nations. And as we go to the places that we are being sent, where we are called to live in, to make disciples in, we are to, in a sense, be an altar-building people. Like we see Abraham at Shechem, as we see Jacob at Shechem, we are to remember the promises that God has made to us and has given us. We are to call out to God in those places. That's what altars are. There are places of remembrance. There are places where people called out to God. We'll get into that more on Sunday. But this chapter reminds us that in these places where we've encountered God, these places where we've been sent to, places of where we're building altars, we're calling out to God, these are also places of conflict. These are places where cultures collide, where people of the nations rub up against us as God's holy people. And bad things can happen in that place. The peoples that we are living among can act in ways that defile and destroy what God is trying to do among us. So this is the question then. What should we do when they do what ought not to be done? Or maybe we could even ask this: what should we do when they do what ought not to be done to us, to our sons and daughters, to our husbands and wives, to us in the workplace? What should we do when this relationship isn't going well and there's defiling and destruction and all that kind of stuff? Well, the New Testament really speaks to that. Jesus himself speaks to that. Jesus came at a time when Israel was under the oppressive government of the Roman oppressor. And what did he say in that context? Matthew 5:38, Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You have heard what it is said, that it is said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn your other cheek also." A little further down, verse 43, "You've heard what it is said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Kind of riffing on these truths, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12 tells the church in Rome he says this: "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Do not take revenge," he also says. "My dear friends," this is what he commands. He says, "Leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This is definitely opposite to what happened in Genesis 34. Jacob's sons sought to overcome evil with evil, and Jesus is saying, and Paul are saying, don't do it. This is not how we represent the kingdom of God. This is not how we represent being God's chosen people in the world to the nations. This is not how we're a blessing to the nations. We aren't to be overcome by evil and do evil back. No, we're to overcome evil by doing good. This is the way of Jesus. It's the way that was practiced during the time of the dominance of the Roman Empire, with all its pagan licentiousness, and it's what we're still called to today. Now, we are experiencing more and more in our own Canadian context, we are experiencing more opposition, an increasing measure of a difficulty as we rub shoulders with nation groups and with the prevalent values of our culture. And we don't know where it's all going to go. We're kind of at a crossroads moment in our nation's history. We'll see what happens and where things will go. But one aspect I think we can relate to out of this story is this idea that it feels like there's a taking of our sons and daughters in an attempt to conform us to the values of the dominant culture that we're living within. And you can kind of see that in this chapter, right? The Hivites wanting to absorb Jacob's family into the dominant culture and into their value system. And I think this is a real danger, that we could become absorbed as God's people into the dominant secular culture of our day in Canada and all its values. You might say, in a sense, that we're in danger of being colonized. Our natural reaction, of course, could be very similar to Jacob's sons who wanted to fight back. You know, they got angry. They had a very angry wrathful reaction. But we could also react by wanting to isolate ourselves, want to protect our children. But Jesus never encourages either of these approaches. In fact, he tells us rather to let our light shine before men, to live in the culture that God sent us to in such a way that we remain holy and do good. It's sort of not a either or. He calls us to be separate in our value system, to represent the kingdom values, to be holy. But then he tells us to live such good lives, as Peter puts it in 1 Peter 2:12, to live such good lives among those who don't believe, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your good deeds and glorify God. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway from Genesis 34. I hope that that is an encouragement to you all. God bless.